This is the Straight Dope Podcast, episode number 2 for season 2. I am videoing this, so if you're watching on YouTube, awesome. I'm going to do some stuff with doodles. I'll try to speak through it for those of you listening, but let's do this. If you want to support this podcast and the whole RifleKraft project, go to RifleKraft.com and get a subscriber membership. Go to Hide TV, subscribe there. Hit up Mile High Shooting, thank them for helping out the podcast, or share, subscribe, talk about it, listen to it, do whatever you want. I made some videos in preparation for some online training courses going on Sniper's Hide, going on Hide TV. They are separate sites that you have to go to independently, but in releasing those, there were some questions about getting started. So this episode is about getting started. Now, it doesn't mean that if you already shoot, this isn't important. But what it means is the way I think about what you want to know and keep track of from the beginning forward, and forward meaning I still do it for myself. There are a couple things that are very, very important as far as I'm concerned, as far as the RifleKraft philosophy is concerned. And for those of you listening, and you've listened to a lot of podcasts, you're probably going to nod your head. But let's talk about it. The first thing that you want to know about any rifle system or anything that you plan to do is your system inherent accuracy. What that is the rifle, the barrel, the action, the ammo. As tight of a group as that you can shoot consistently is the system inherent accuracy. It's trying to remove the shooter as much as possible. Tends to be the things that you see online. Oh, look at my awesome shot group. Look at my awesome shot group. That's referring to the system inherent accuracy. And if you keep track of that in mils, or if you start to make what I call brackets, which we'll do here in a minute, we'll start to stack those errors, stack those tolerances. So if you're picking a rifle and you don't have one, you want to know what manufacturer or barrel is going to make one that's consistent enough to produce or have the highest likelihood of having a small group. Nowadays, barrels must be easier to make. Technology got better because most, even factory barrels, are capable of producing very small groups. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't seen rifles that shoot humongous groups, but those are exceptions now. I think that most factory rifles, most rifles that you just, if I go to Cabela's or I go somewhere else, not Mile High Shooting, they only carry good stuff. So if I get something there, it's going to shoot half inch or better probably. If I go to somewhere else, I don't know. But I bet I could walk in and buy any cheap rifle and some factory ammo. I'll probably shoot under an inch. Nevertheless, that doesn't equate to performance expectations down the road. So your baseline is determined at 100 yards because we zero at 100 yards and the time of flight to 100 yards is so short that environmental factors don't really scale in. And we'll get to that either in this podcast episode or in videos or future podcasts. But if you do gun number, it's not linear. And so at the barrel, it takes a tremendous amount of wind to create a movement of size that's going to cause the deviations that we kind of translate that to a distance. But nevertheless, 100 yards. So what do we do at 100 yards? We do the craft drill, but that's positional. I've got a training assessment, diagnostic, and drill target. The camera's not focused on it, but it's concentric circles. The inner circle is 2/10, and then 1/10 in expanding rings that are scored. The reason I figured this would be a little bit out of focus, so I've made a quick chalkboard bracket, and I will be filling this in on the talk today, but let's start with system inherent accuracy. Let's say these are 10th intervals. Let's say you shoot and your system's capable of 2/10 accuracy. Essentially what that means is that the shots might be dispersed randomly, but that is going to be in a 2/10 bracket in your reticle. So if that was the case, then in bench rest shooting or whatever, if you were shooting at 100 yards or you were shooting at a distance where environmental stress, shooter effects weren't going to matter, as long as the target was bigger than this bracket in your reticle, you have a high probability of hitting it, right? Probably 100%. Don't want to say 100 because somebody could fuck up. So 99.9, 99.7. If the target's bigger than the bracket that you're shooting in all the time, you're going to hit it, right? Does that make sense? The problem is that's not reality. That's system inherent accuracy. And it's important and it's a baseline. So make sure that when you're buying products, the ammo and the rifle are capable of producing that. Now, ammunition gets a lot of attention. People want standard deviations that are small. They want to do all sorts of stuff. I've been talking about some tests that we did with time of flight. What I determined was inside of a second time of flight, the determining factor is your system inherent accuracy, the group size at 100. Now, if you're doing positional shooting, it's based on your positional inputs on top of the system inherent accuracy. So if you do a craft drill, you'll know that that's bigger than what you can shoot when you're doing load development. That's the bracket that I'm talking to, but that's going to be the determining factor. You're not going to see time of flight issues with your dope, and you certainly won't see that expressed out in wind because the drop of time is greater than the drift of wind. So you want to make sure that the ammo shoots a tight group to a second time of flight. Between a second and 1.5, it starts to mix, and then after 1.5 second time of flight, standard deviation, or not standard deviation, but the consistency of the velocities make a tremendous difference because the bullets are slowing down and the vertical starts to increase between them. So if you're going to shoot something after a second and a half time of flight, which a lot of people do, you have to make sure that those velocities are consistent. Your standard deviation is single digit and low, or probability of hit becomes redonkulous. So, time of flight, check. 100-yard group, system inherent accuracy, awesome. Wind. This hasn't to do with the rifle necessarily, but it does with the caliber that you're picking. Now, I've drawn a chart, and I'm going to show that on Frank's video, but what it does is outlines the mile per hour of your caliber. And I put 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mile per hour is a way of thinking about or talking about your bullets, speed, and BC combined so that you can predict the wind drift. 308s are 4s. You got 6.5 Creedmoors, you've got 6 Dashers, 6 BRs in that 5 to 6 window. A lot of that depends on the density altitude. I'm a mile an hour faster here in Colorado than I am down at sea level, so the same load is going to be slower, not slower, same velocity. It's gonna have more drag at sea level, so it's going to take longer to get there. And if it takes longer, it's exposed to the wind longer. If exposed to the wind longer, you're going to see more drift if there's wind. Nevertheless, if you're picking a caliber, you want to consider your ability to read wind. If you don't shoot, you probably want to get one that allows you to shoot the distances with better wind resistance. What I mean by that is a lot of times people recommend 308s. 308s are 4 mile an hour guns. At 800 yards, they're 2 mile an hour guns. If you want to shoot outside of 800 yards, the wind deflection per mile an hour is so much that usually if you superimpose the bracket of a target, the variation is bigger than the target itself. Does that make sense? So if I take this bracket, and let's say your 308 shot a 2/10 bracket. Now, at 800 yards, it's a 2 mile an hour gun, which means 2 miles an hour is going to move it a tenth. And if you start adding miles per hour variability, that variation get added on top of your group size, if this pen is the variation of wind, it's going to have to be at least 5/10 just to account for that variation. Now, if you have a 6-mile-an-hour gun, you've got about 5 miles an hour at that distance instead of 2. And so 5 miles an hour is going to move it 1/10. So if you're off underneath that, it's going to be less than 1/10 of drift error. Can you do it with a 308? Absolutely. Good shooters are capable of excellent groups in wind at distance, but their wind reading and their skill has to account for narrowing that margin of error. So for a beginner, it helps to have a 6-mile-an-hour gun. Now, I don't like the 7s, and I'll tell you why. For a beginner, they tend to be faster, heavier, bigger cartridges. They have more recoil, and on that recoil, it's going to be hard to recoil manage and have a good sight picture to see what's happening. And so even though they have a mile an hour more budget, the time of flight between a second and 1.5 scales pretty evenly for 5, 6, 7. So the only difference is the miles per hour, but the amount of recoil that you get on a 7-mile-an-hour gun is enough to disrupt your sight picture so that you don't get the feedback that you want. But a 6-mile-an-hour gun and a 5-mile-an-hour gun, actually in those distances, 6 tends to beat the 5s because the 5s are the slower, heavier ones, and they'll maintain momentum at distance. But that close range recoil management tends to be a little bit harder. So thinking about that gives you budget for wind so that you can learn, because you want to hit a plate or you want to hit a target and learn from it and grow. And as your skill grows, you progress. But I like the idea that you're going to get things that you can learn from, and you'll also have success. So if you want to go shoot, you'll be able to hit stuff and not just spend a ton of money throwing bullets down, hoping one of them hits. All right, which kind of pulls it all together into the cone of fire. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here with this brackets. Now I only have, actually that's not true. I got another yellow. So if your system inherent accuracy, in this case, is 2/10, and your skill as a shooter adds error, and you determine that error by doing the craft drill, right? You take your system inherent accuracy, you take your craft drill. Your craft drill includes the system inherent accuracy, but when you compare the two, you can see what your margin of shooter error is. So let's say you add 4/10. If you add 4/10, then your bracket is going to be like this. So if you did a craft drill, I would expect that group, right, to be 6/10. The only way to tell what your error was is to then get a system inherent accuracy test done and subtract it, right? So here, the shooter's error is 0.4. Shooter, 0.4. System inherent accuracy, 0.2. And then we need to consider wind variation. How good are you at measuring and assessing the wind? That's different when you shoot multiple rounds, because once you take one shot and see where it goes, you're not wind calling anymore, you're correcting. So we need to discriminate and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. If I say take 10 shots at that target, your wind call is going to be reflected in that first shot. Your corrections are going to be reflected in the next 9. So that's not a 90% wind call. That's your ability to correct. Both are very important, right? And in competition, the correction is probably more important than the wind call, because if you miss your first shot on every stage, make a good correction, you'll still get 90%, right? Assuming there's 10 shots per stage. So you can still get a good score if you're good at corrections. There's more correction shots than there are wind calls. So that's a skill that's vital. We'll talk about that later. But if you're hunting, you want that first round to hit it, unless you're deliberately missing your first shot. But a shooter's error, let's say, is plus or minus 3 miles an hour. 3 miles an hour at these distances is 3/10. So if we add a tenth and a half, 1.5 tenths, we've got wind, right? And now we've starting to get this cone of fire idea where if we add stress, there might be more wobble. So we can kind of hash out possible areas here. But let's add this up. We got one. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 plus 1 because we got half. That's 0.9, right? That's 3 MOA or 0.9 mils. If you put your reticle on a target and you have the correct dope for that distance, if your target is bigger than 0.9, you've got a probability of hitting it in this case. Can you still hit it if you have a low probability? Absolutely, right? It's just going to go somewhere in here, and if your target happens to be inside that circle, it's going to go somewhere, but a lot of that is inside the circle, but some of it's out, so you might miss, and if you do, odds are you should do the same thing because randomly it's going to go into this and it could hit it. But if you correct off that, you're moving the whole thing off in the direction of where you missed, which could lead you on a wild goose chase. I did do a test with some of the people I coach where every time they took a shot, even if it was inside their group, move that impact to their point of aim. Keep doing that, and the bullets danced away from the target. So knowing whether you should make a correction or do the same thing has something to do with understanding your bracket. Clearly, with skill, you want to bring this bracket down, but what do you work on first? If your system is 2/10 and you waste time and money bringing that down, and your fundamentals are 4/10, right? You've got twice the value in bringing your skill down than it does upgrading your ammo or upgrading your rifle. Let's say you're 2/10, you bring it down to 1.5. Well, then this overall bracket is now 0.75 instead of 0.9. But if you bring your shooter skill down 2/10, it's 0.7. And I guarantee that most shooters, I could bring their group size down by 2/10 in about a month. You probably spend thousands of dollars changing your barrel, your loading, and think about all the time spent at a bench rather than time spent behind your rifle. Bringing these brackets down and doing a cone of fire diagram like this reveals where the low-hanging fruit is. Now, we just made this up talking, but if the shooter is 0.4, the inherent accuracy is 0.2, and in this case, the wind is 0.3, the easiest way to make up growth is by focusing on the shooter. And doing that, you can simultaneously work wind, because you can work a lot of wind without even shooting. Right? It's just kind of knowing what to practice and how to think about it. But I've got guys down to easily within 2 miles an hour without actually shooting much. But we talk a lot and we do a lot of thought exercises and thought things like this, which brings their wind reading and their wind abilities down to about 0.2. So in this case, if we can bring your shooting to about an inch, then we've got 0.3. And in doing that, we could probably bring the wind down to 0.2. There's 2/10 out of that right away, and you didn't change your system inherent accuracy. Now, how do I boil this down to what do I need to get started, right? Because that's how we started, and this is where we end up. It means understanding the distances that you want to shoot. You can't just say, well, I want to shoot long range. Okay. PRS and NRL is largely inside of 1,000. Just, making shit up. ELR or long range matches, they're outside of 1,000. You can shoot a little bit here and there. I know there's PRS and NRL shots that are at 1,100 or 1,150, but we're not talking about a ton of shots out there. The averages are probably between 600 and 700 yards. The hunter matches, the averages are probably around 500 yards, I would guess. Sniper matches and field matches, you just don't know because that's the idea. You don't really know much. Competition dynamics, which kind of fits in between all that stuff. Very precision, very speed, very everything, but you got to find the targets. It'll say 800, 900, 1200 and in, but there's always shots that are further. But the average always comes down to around the gun numbers. If you don't have good fundamentals, that's going to be the easiest thing to work on. But you want to make sure that your system inherent accuracy is decent. Otherwise, your groups are going to be very big. If the average craft group is 3.5 now, we're talking about a pretty big bracket, right? That's about $1 million. Adding system error to that is going to add another 0.3, 0.4. And so you want to marginalize it so that you can isolate the variables, because if everything is a big group, it's hard to differentiate what's happening, which is why I like paper at 100, because if we're shooting at distance, a miss could be a lot of things that we can't put our finger on. It could be fundamentals. It could be wind. It could be dope. It could be all sorts of stress. If we do it at 100, we've isolated some of those, and we say if you can maintain that group there, we know your fundamentals are capable of it. Therefore, the probability of a miss at distance is likely going to be one of those other things. It doesn't rule it out, but it makes it more likely. And if we isolate the components that are required, we could target them with very specific training. If you're going to run a marathon, you're going to do cardio and legs. Right? If you're doing jiu-jitsu, you're going to do cardio, but you're going to do a lot of other stuff physically. If you're swimming, same thing. If you're powerlifting, it's all working exercise. It's all working your body, but it's working different elements, and you don't want to work the wrong thing, right? A 100-yard sprinter, if they're in the gym doing heavy curls, it's probably not going to express itself in better performance on the racetrack. This is how we do that. You can do it yourself. If you're listening to this and you're not a subscriber, you're not a part of the RifleKraft program, you haven't reached out to me for coaching, then you're probably doing it on your own or somebody else is helping you. This is what I would tell people. Hey, I want to do it on my own, but can you kind of give me some advice? This is the advice. Getting started, get a system that's capable of doing what you want. Get a caliber that is capable of having the targets that you're shooting at inside of a second or 1.25 time of flight. If you don't hand load, then doesn't matter. And then you shoot and the groups are big, it's all you, right? And the answer often points back to the shooter. You got to work skill. You can't get around it. How do you know it's you? Shoot paper, shoot distance, compare the two, take away the variable, and it'll show you time and time again, we all have things that we need to work on. Having it put on paper and graphed out in front of you is a real good way to say, yep, I need to do that. If I spend 100 hours on the loading bench and I make my group from 0.3 to 0.2, I took 1/10 off my bracket, but if my bracket's 9/10, I'm still shooting 8/10. And if I work my skill, I could bring that to 5/10 very quickly. Right? We can cut shooters' groups in half in a short period of time, working fundamentals, teaching them what is important and what isn't. Half of it is just deconstructing bullshit that they read on the internet or things that they heard on a podcast. Well, I heard I should do this way, but look, I didn't get any better. Yeah, totally. Whatever you do, measure it, practice, measure it again. If it got better, you're kicking ass. If it didn't get better, I wouldn't waste any more time on it. I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't complain about it. I would find something else to do. Try that. When it works, great. When it stops working, find something else. There's no point looking backward and being like, man, I should have, would have, could have, whatever. Man, if you're not constantly getting better, something's wrong. You can figure out what's wrong and you can change your destiny. So here we are at the Straight Dope Podcast, changing destinies. Wow. Thanks for listening. I will see you next week.